Okay, well, here we go. When Adam first asked me to do this, I realized that the presentation was going to be occurring on November 3rd, just 2 days before the election. And I thought maybe I should do something political. And then I realized a few seconds later, no, everyone's going to be completely politicked out by November 3rd. So I thought maybe I'll just do something fun instead. So I decided to talk about one of my favorite directors, Edgar G. Ulmer, who's not particularly well known beyond a certain uh, secret society of cineasts who are really into Ulmer. So I hope to initiate all of you into the cult of Ulmer by the time this is over. The title of the talk is Mr. Ulmer's Cabinet of Wonder, Edgar G. Ulmer and the Cinema of High Strangeness. And this presentation will tie in with my next nonfiction book, which is called Hollywood Haunts the World, an investigation into the cinema of occulted taboos, which is coming out from Head Press in the fall of 2025. But it's available for pre-order right now from headpress.com. So you can go on over there and pre-order a copy if you're intrigued by what you hear today. Um, I'm going to be talking mostly about The Man from Planet X, which might be one of Ulmer's most important films, though I don't think that that was immediately recognized when the film was released back in 1951, which is his most overtly Fordian film. And at first, I was going to focus the talk just on those Ulmer films that have overt Fordian elements, paranormal, supernatural elements. But that would leave out some of my favorite Ulmer films. So I'm going to be talking about Ulmer's films beyond just the Fortean ones as well, because I really think that even in the films that are not overtly Fortean, there's a kind of philosophy or attitude or point of view that is in some way Fortean, or it's so transgressive and iconoclastic that it overlaps with the Fortean point of view, I think. Um, so before I get to The Man from Planet X, I want to talk about some of the films that Ulmer did leading up to The Man from Planet X. Um, it Ulmer's reputation begins to rise in the 1960s, near the tail end of his career and the tail end of his life. He died in 72. Beginning in the early 1960s, the auteur theory comes into being. And you have critics, particularly in France, who are beginning to elevate directors, American directors, who were previously seen to be just hack B-movie craftsmen. Um, and so rather than talking about the masters like Alfred Hitchcock or John Huston, suddenly you had French film critics raving about rather obscure filmmakers like Edgar Ulmer, Samuel Fuller, uh, Bud Bedecker, people like this, people who were doing either B westerns or B horror films or just whatever job they could pick up along the way. And despite the fact that it would bounce around from genre to genre, and were not well lauded by the critics at the time, perhaps, nonetheless, there's a consistent point of view and theme that rolls through their entire career. And these French film critics began to see this and began writing articles about it. And so people like Ulmer, Bedecker, Fuller began to be elevated. Um, so as a result of this renewed interest, Peter Bogdanovich, who was just beginning his film career at the time, he interviews Ulmer in 1970, only 2 years before Ulmer passes away. And as far as I know, it's the only really serious interview that was conducted with Ulmer during his entire lifetime. At this point, Bogdanovich was just beginning his film career with films like Targets, um, which starred Boris Karloff and was Karloff's last films. Um, So Bogdanovich, he interviews Ulmer, and this brings more attention to Ulmer's career. And Ulmer influenced many directors, not just Bogdanovich, but he influenced Francois Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Martin Scorsese, John Landis, Joe Dante, and David Lynch. Certainly, Lost Highway would not exist without Detour, which is possibly Ulmer's most famous film. I would argue that a wonderful double feature would be Detour and then Lost Highway. I think you would see a lot of correspondences between those two films. Um, some people say that Lost Highway is part of Lynch's Hollywood trilogy, Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire. But I would actually argue that Lost Highway is actually a part of a different trilogy. And perhaps I'll talk about that later if I have time. But we will definitely talk more about David Lynch later on. So just briefly, the beginning of Ulmer's career, it begins in Germany. According to Ulmer, he worked with Fritz Lang, Paul Wegener, and F.W. Murnau. We're talking the directors of Nosferatu, The Golem, Metropolis. So the pioneers of German Expressionism. And he comes to the United States, and in the 1930s, he lands the job of directing The Black Cat for Universal. So this is the first time that Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff are teamed together in the same film. And it's ostensibly an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's famous short story, The Black Cat, but really it has almost nothing to do with the original Poe story. And I don't think it was Ulmer's intention to do an adaptation of Poe's story. I think that he was really doing an homage to the kind of transgressive spirit of Poe, as opposed to doing a literal translation of Poe. So if you come into it thinking it's an adaptation of the original story, you'll be confused or disappointed. If you come into it thinking, no, this is more of a manifesting the spirit of Poe in the form of cinema, then maybe you won't be so confused. Um, I've read an interview with Tom Weaver, who's the premier expert on the Universal horror films of that time period in the golden age of Hollywood. And an interviewer asked Weaver what his favorite Universal horror film was. And generally, you would think somebody might pick The Bride of Frankenstein or The Wolfman, etc. But he picked The Black Cat, and I would have to agree with that. I think The Black Cat might be the most artistically avant-garde of the original Universal horror films. It was a huge financial hit for Universal Studios, and it was also one of the main reasons for the horror ban in England. There was a series of films that came out of America, including The Black Cat, including The Raven, which also starred Karloff and Lugosi the following year after The Black Cat, and Todd Browning's Freaks, um, Carl Freund's Mad Love, starring Peter Lorre. These films were so transgressive for the time period that England decided not to allow any more American horror films into the country, and so that cut off a huge that was a big cut in Universal's finances and the finances of Hollywood films in general. So this resulted in essentially a voluntary horror ban on the part of the American studios. They simply stopped making horror films for about 3 years until 1939, when suddenly Universal came back into it with Son of Frankenstein. But the reason the Black Cat was so offensive to some people was because Ulmer, who co-wrote the script, he wasn't just the director. Ulmer co-wrote the Black Cat. He managed to pack in many taboos in only 1 hour and 6 minutes. You in a very short film, you've got incest, necrophilia, Satanism, human vivisection, rape, voyeurism, sadism, insanity induced by wartime trauma, PTSD. and of course, good old-fashioned murder, and all in 1 hour and 6 minutes. Karloff plays Hjalmar Polzig, who's an architect and a cultist, clearly based on Aleister Crowley. Um, and this isn't the first time that we have a film with a major character based on Aleister Crowley. Before The Black Cat, there's a silent film that I highly recommend, Rex Ingram's The Magician, which is based on Somerset Maugham's novel of the same name. And uh, it's an interesting film in the sense that you can see that a lot of the visuals of The Magician, I think, inspired the visuals of the early 1930s Universal horror films. If you watch The Magician and then watch James Whale's Frankenstein, I think you'll see a definite influence there. The film critic David Callett described The Black Cat this way. He said, quote, "It looked like the Dadaist art of the Bauhaus school had literally come to life," unquote. As I said, it was the biggest financial hit for Universal that year, but Ulmer did not benefit from that in any way. Um, this is the beginning of a life of great artistic success, but a lot of bad luck. Um, in that sense, his career is similar to Orson Welles, I suppose you might say. The problems for Ulmer began when he initiates a romantic relationship with a young woman named Shirley Castler, who was the script supervisor for The Black Cat. She was also married to producer Max Alexander, who was the nephew of Carl Lumbly, the head of Universal Studios. Um, Lumley was not happy with this situation because Shirley divorced Max Alexander and married Ulmer, which was quite a scandal at the time. This results in Ulmer being blacklisted from every major studio in Hollywood. Ultimately, I think this is a romantic story. However, Edgar and Shirley remained married and continued to collaborate with one another until Ulmer's death in 1972. He died in Woodland Hills at age 68 in September of 1962, only a few months after I was born. Um, Shirley, she often wrote or contributed to the scripts of his films, so they weren't just married to one another. They were involved in a lifelong artistic collaboration. Edgar and Shirley, they eventually have one daughter, Ariane, who will act in some of his films and ultimately be the advocate who saves a lot of his films from obscurity. Because he was not really backed by a major studio at any point in his career, a lot of his films were not preserved as they should have been. And so it took the advocacy of his daughter to go around and try to find pristine copies of these films and preserve them. And many of them have now been, some of the most important ones have been restored. For example, the recent Criterion Blu-ray of Detour looks really amazing. I recommend that particular release. Um, so as a result of this blacklist, Ulmer and his young wife Shirley, they have to work well outside the Hollywood system. They have to leave California, and they moved to New York. And eventually, in 1939, they make a film called Moon Over Harlem. Shirley wrote the script. The film's unusual in that it features an all-black cast. The black characters in the film are never portrayed as stereotypes in any way. And keep in mind, this is 39, so this is the same year Hollywood is making Gone with the Wind. Um, Moon Over Harlem is a kind of pre-noir crime drama about this mafia-like criminal organization called the Mason Gang, who are extorting black-owned businesses in Harlem. Um, and this is an interesting detail. This is a sign of the DIY techniques that Ulmer needed to rely upon in order to make his films. This is kind of like the ultimate in DIY filmmaking from the 1930s era. Ulmer filmed the entire movie using what are called short ends. Those are unused scraps of leftover film stock from previous films. And so they had to stitch together these short ends from all these other films in order to film this new movie, and that's dedication. The entire film cost $8,000 and was shot in 4 days. And to put that in perspective, Gone with the Wind cost $3.85 million at the same time. Um, Moon Over Harlem was a financial success. It was popular and played not only on the black circuit, but all the film circuits at that time. And it was a success because it was essentially made for nothing. But no matter how much success Ulmer had, it never seemed to have any lasting effect. He was always starting over from zero. So in the early 40s, he moves back to Los Angeles and he becomes head of production at PRC. Uh, PRC stood for Producers Releasing Corporation, but everyone in town called it Poverty Row Corporation. It was the lowest, the bottom of the barrel of Hollywood film studios, and as a result, it was completely under the radar. Their entire purpose was simply to make B films, and Hakeem Bey, who wrote TAZ, Temporary Autonomous Zone, he says in that book that you have to, if you want to make uh, transgressive artwork, you have to find your temporary autonomous zone. You have to find that area, that field that nobody's looking at, nobody's paying attention to it, which means it's probably not making any money. If it was making money, people would be paying attention to it. And the temporary autonomous zone, it's always temporary. It never lasts because eventually, if it's successful enough, people start looking at it, and then you got to leave and go find another temporary autonomous zone to continue your artwork. For Ulmer, that was PRC. PRC was his temporary autonomous zone. Nobody was looking at it. It was not respected. However, there was a film studio, and so as long as he could keep his projects well under budget, um, he was able to do pretty much whatever the hell he wanted to do. And so he makes some of his strangest films here at PRC. It's his most productive period of his entire life. Here at PRC, he makes Bluebeard, starring John Carradine. You could describe it as one of the first slasher films. Ulmer keeps throughout his career keeps initiating subgenres that will later become extremely successful in Hollywood. But he's always there right at the beginning. So with Bluebeard, essentially without Bluebeard, you don't have Psycho or Halloween or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, etc. In the film, John Carradine plays Gaston Morel. He's a serial killer slash painter who feels compelled to murder the women who model for him after he's translated his victim's spirit into artwork. Gaston is also a puppeteer, which adds another level of high strangeness to the film. Um, it's another example of Ulmer being ahead of that curve and laying down the template for a subgenre that really won't come into being really until the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, with the success of filmmakers like Mario Bava and Dario Argenta doing the Giallo films in Italy, and then Tobe Hooper and John Carpenter in the United States with Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, etc. But Ulmer was there first, well before, decades before. The paintings that Gaston Morel create in the film were specifically made to resemble the work of Salvador Dali. And according to Ulmer's daughter, Ulmer and Dali were extremely good friends, which I think is telling. I think Ulmer perceived himself as belonging to an avant-garde artistic tradition, as a surrealist tradition, as opposed to being a just another filmmaker. In the next year, in 45, he makes a film called Strange Illusion, and the title alone says a great deal about Ulmer's ambitions with the film. It could be accurately described as a metaphysical detective story. I wouldn't be surprised if David Lynch was a fan of this film, particularly since we know he is a fan of Detour. It shares certain similarities with Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks. Strange Illusion is packed full of dreams, synchronicities, omens, and occult symbols. The main character is Paul Cartwright, who uses dreams to solve a murder mystery. Cartwright is similar to Special Agent Dale Cooper in some respects. He's seemingly a clean-cut, innocent young man, but he's also neurotic and obsessed with criminology. So in that sense, he kind of resembles Jeffrey Beaumont, the main character of Blue Velvet. At one point in the film, Cartwright's friend says to him, "This dream detection beats anything I've ever heard." So Cartwright is actually referred to in the film as a dream detective. That's not something I'm making up or projecting onto the film. The term dream detective is actually used in the film itself. Strange Illusion also prefigures later films such as Bud Bediker's Behind Locked Doors, Samuel Fuller's Shock Corridor, and Milos Forman's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In the sense that Cartwright pretends to be a mental patient in order to go undercover in a psych ward to uncover evidence of this serious crime. After Strange Illusion, he does what is probably his most critically acclaimed film, his most famous film, which is Detour. It's definitely, if I were to do a list of the top 20 or top 10 or top five film noirs, Detour would always be at the top of the list. Um, it's the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre and the absurdist philosophies of Charles Fort kind of combine in Detour. And I believe Detour is a Fordian film in some respects. It's a kind of dramatic manifesto celebrating or at least acknowledging the sort of inescapable inherent absurdity of human existence. And I believe Charles Fort would have appreciated it. Um, by the way, this is interesting. According to Doug Skinner, who is the literary executor of John Keel and runs johnkeel.com, Keel once said that Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, influenced Keel more than Charles Fort. So if you really want to understand John Keel's mind, I suggest reading On Being and Nothingness right next to the books of Charles Fort. You got to put them together. Uh, and Detour combines both strains into a single storyline, I think. One could write more extensively about that topic, and maybe I will. Uh, David Lynch's Lost Highway, which was co-written by Barry Gifford, who wrote Wild at Heart, it clearly emerges from Detour. The parallels are definitely there, and I really do encourage you to watch both Detour and Lost Highway side by side or back to back. You could do it side by side, I guess. You could watch them both simultaneously and keep moving from one screen to the next. Detour drills into the dark side of human psychology, and in that sense, prefigures the new Hollywood of the 1960s, such films as Easy Rider, Midnight Cowboy, Godfather, Taxi Driver, etc. Ulmer's film was kind of like the road sign, pointing the way to the future, to the darker, more realistic, brutal subject matters that would come to the fore in the 70s. Ulmer briefly escapes Poverty Row with the unlikely help of Hedy Lamarr. Um, Lamarr was one of the most highly paid women in the world in the 1940s. She was a very intelligent person, and in fact, she was a visionary inventor. This is not particularly well known, but she wasn't just an actress. She went out of, in fact, there's a Netflix documentary called Bombshell that I recommend that's all about Hedy Lamarr and the invention that she created. Without Hedy Lamarr, we wouldn't have Wi-Fi. Um, it's actually a pretty incredible story. The military would not give her credit for her invention, and they basically stole her patent. I think my late friend Richard Schoengert would identify with the travails of Hedy Lamarr back in the 1940s. As I said, she was the most highly paid woman in the world at the time, or among the top most highly paid women in certainly in America at that time. So I don't know if this hurt her really financially, but they did deny her credit for her invention. She went out of her way to break the blacklist that was against Ulmer. So for her next film, The Strange Woman, which I think is Hedy Lamarr's best performance, she refused to work with any director other than Ulmer for this film. Uh, and in the 1940s, Lamarr had the influence to pull that off. She knew Ulmer was the only director in Hollywood who was willing to go the distance for this film, The Strange Woman. Note that it's the second Ulmer film to have the word strange in the title. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but I do think it says something about Ulmer's unusual sensibilities that Lamarr thought he was the only guy in Hollywood who could direct this particular film. The Strange Woman is set in Bangor, Maine in the early 1800s. And of course, oddly enough, we will later associate Bangor, Maine with Stephen King. Um, Stephen King lives in Bangor, Maine, and a lot of his novels stories take place there. But The Strange Woman is not a horror film, though certain aspects of Jenny Hager's life are certainly horrific. Jenny Hager is the main character played by Hedy Lamarr. Working together, Ulmer and Lamarr are able to take the taboo topics of The Strange Woman right to the edge. Incest, child abuse, religious hypocrisy, misogyny, class warfare, racism, all these topics are woven into this film. And if you remove any of these elements from the storyline, the whole film would just fall apart. In 1946, I don't think you could have gone any farther than Lamarr and Ulmer do in this film without having the storyline severely censored by the Hays Code, the Hays Board at the time. The Strange Woman is both a financial and artistic success, like The Black Cat and other films that Ulmer did, but Ulmer does not benefit from it. He gets ripped off by PRC. He's justifiably pissed off about this, and he quits the studio in protest. So now he's back to being a freelance director without even a Poverty Row studio backing his efforts. But in a few years later, in 1948, he bounces back and he makes one of his best films, Ruthless. 2 days from now will be November 5th. It will be Election Day, which would be a very appropriate day to watch Ruthless. The main theme of which is relevant in this year's election cycle, I believe. A Blu-ray of the film was released by Olive a few years ago, but if you're not too picky, you can see the entire film on archive.org. It's a watchable print, and I highly recommend watching Ruthless on Election Day. It's a character study of a narcissist who will do whatever he needs to in order to succeed. It's a three-dimensional and even somewhat sympathetic portrait of a lifelong narcissist. The protagonist of Ruthless is Horace Vendig, who's a wealthy, predatory investor who presents himself to the world as a caring philanthropist. But this is just a cover for his more sadistic pastimes, which involve playing with people's lives as if they were pieces on a chessboard. The main screenwriter of Ruthless was Alva Bessie. He did not receive any on-screen credit because he was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee at the time, and he was fingered as one of the infamous Hollywood 10, the first wave of writers and directors to be victims of the blacklist. 2 years after the release of Ruthless, Bessie served 10 months in prison for contempt of Congress because he refused to confirm or deny his communist affiliations when he appeared before the committee. So if you decide to watch Ruthless on Election Day, I would say that the film's last sentence sums up the situation in which the United States finds itself at the moment. I think it has one of the best lines of any 1940s American films. 3 years after Ruthless, Ulmer directs one of his most Fordian films, The Man from Planet X. And again, I would say it's one of his most important films. It was written and produced by Jack Paloxvin and Aubrey Wisberg. Just as I mentioned about Detour, if I were to compile a list of the top 20 most important science fiction films of all time, I think The Man from Planet X would have to be included on that list. Um, and if I were to come up with the top 20 horror films, the Black Cat would be on that list as well. Um, the Man from Planet X is the first feature-length alien invasion movie to come out of Hollywood. There were previous Republic serials that kind of flirted with that theme, Flash Gordon serials and things like that. But The Man from Planet X is something else entirely. Clearly intended to be a serious feature-length film for adults, not just the children who are the primary audience of the Republic serials. The Man from Planet X kicks off a wave of science fiction films that flooded theaters throughout the 1950s. And it's a wave, that never really ended. I own a copy of Life magazine from that period, the early 50s, and there's this amusing article in it that talks about this new trend of science fiction films. And the whole attitude of the article is saying, is this temporary? Is this like a hula hoop fad, or is this going to continue on and on like this? And there's a kind of a note of derision about the article. And it strangely parallels articles that came out around the time of the success of Iron Man in 2008 or The Dark Knight, where it was film critics kind of saying, how long is this going to last? Is this just a temporary fad? And of course, it continues to just go on and on. And now superhero movies are just kind of an accepted subgenre of film. And that's kind of like where science fiction was in the early 50s. It was really derided by critics, but people kept coming to see them. Um, the production history of The Man from Planet X is linked with the UFO phenomenon itself. At that time, if you've ever gone to a library, which I've done, you go to like the UCLA library and look at the microfiche of the archived newspapers from that time period. You'll see that almost every single day there are UFO stories emblazoned on the front page of all the major newspapers at that time. Every single day, a new UFO story right there on the headlines. So Hollywood takes note of this interest, of course. Um, Almost all the initial science fiction movies given the green light by major studios revolved around UFO imagery or invading aliens. The Man from Planet X, The Thing, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Invaders from Mars, It Came from Outer Space, Phantom from Space, Robot Monster, The War of the Worlds, etc. Um, in Screams of Reason, which is a book by David J. Stahl, who tragically died in a car accident on New Year's Eve last year, unfortunately. Um, Stahl claimed in that book that reports of UFO encounters and alien abductions were entirely inspired by popular science fiction films and TV shows like The Outer Limits. And I would argue the exact opposite, with all due respect to the late David Stahl. It's clear that the armada of science fiction films that invaded the cinema during the 1950s was inspired by real life reports of UFOs and alien encounters that were emblazoned all over these newspapers on a daily basis, beginning with Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting over Mount Rainier in Washington State. Um, Science fiction fans don't really like to think about this very much, but one has to wonder how the literary genre of science fiction would have evolved over the last half of the 20th century if you remove Kenneth Arnold's historic sighting from the equation. You just pluck that incident out of the timeline. No UFOs, no newspaper headlines, no Destination Moon based on Robert Heinlein's work, no It Came from Outer Space, written by Ray Bradbury. If these early films had not been a success, further science fiction films would not have followed. Um, I remember reading an interview with Ray Bradbury where he said that in the 70s, when Bradbury saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind on opening night, he was very impressed with it and wrote a glowing review of it. And he got a phone call from Steven Spielberg, and Spielberg said, "How did you like your movie?" And Bradbury said, "What do you mean my movie?" And Spielberg said, "Well, It Came from Outer Space. Close Encounters of the Third Kind would not have existed if I had not seen It Came from Outer Space when I was a child in the theater." Um, but Spielberg could just as easily have called up Kenneth Arnold, who was still alive in 1977, and he could have said to Kenneth Arnold, "Kenneth, how did you like your movie?" Because without Kenneth Arnold, there would be no It Came from Outer Space, and therefore there would be no Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Um, I've heard a lot of science fiction writers interviews with science fiction writers who were working in the 70s, people like Robert Silverberg, Philip K. Dick. I've heard interviews with them where they express some annoyance at the sudden popularity of a certain kind of science fiction in the wake of Star Wars. So people like Phil Dick or Robert Silverberg, who were using the science fiction genre to really explore some cutting edge themes, really bemoaned the sudden entrance of all these, I guess they would perceive them as newbies, entering into the science fiction field, and that the science fiction field, because of Star Wars, was suddenly a potential gold mine. And so that temporary autonomous zone of science fiction was over. And people like Silverberg and Phil Dick said, now that there was the potential of making a great deal of money in the genre, that the genre had essentially become dumbed down. But nonetheless, you can't have art without an audience. As Marshall McLuhan once said, a football game without an audience is a practice, and a play without an audience is called a rehearsal. So without the audience, there is no event. Um, there's no artwork. So UFOs, followed by the science fiction films of the 50s, definitely broadened the audience, the potential audience for science fiction. Um, if you imagine an alternate universe where Kenneth Arnold's sighting never occurred or never made the front pages in 2004, would science fiction exist only as a niche genre, followed by a few eccentrics like the literary equivalent of falcon hunting? Would it have died out entirely? There are plenty of genres and subgenres that have died out. In the 1930s, one of the most popular pulp magazines was called Railroad Stories. And in 2024, there are no railroad story cosplay contests. There's no railroad story conventions. There's no railroad story multiverse being developed into a series of interlinked films for Netflix. Is this what would have happened to science fiction without the popular interest in UFOs? I think it's an interesting question. But Hollywood always follows the money. So not only were UFOs a hot topic in the late 40s and 50s, but they were not owned by anybody. According to mainstream scientists, they didn't even exist. So things that don't exist can't sue Hollywood studios for defamation of character or copyright infringement. This is why conspiracy theories have always been popular among the uh, human cogs of the Hollywood dream machine. Um, I remember communicating with the editor of New Dawn magazine uh, many years ago, 20 years ago, having a conversation with him, and he said, most of the subscriptions for New Dawn magazine come out of Southern California. Why do you think that is? And I said, well, that's where all the Hollywood producers are, and they're ripping off the conspiracy theories in your magazine and turning them into films. Because you can't copyright a conspiracy theory. With that as context, it's illuminating to note how important The Man from Planet X was in terms of the vast scheme of pop culture. If The Man from Planet X and The Thing came out 1 week after The Man from Planet X. If those two films had failed at the box office, there would have been no subsequent wave of science fiction films. But The Man from Planet X did not fail. It was a huge financial success and made on a shoestring budget. Years of inventive penny pinching techniques on Ulmer's part had led to this moment, this one most special project. So, how did the first feature film about an alien invasion get made in Hollywood? Back in 2010, I communicated with a man named Burl Lampert, who was among the closest friends of Jack Paloxvin in the later years of Paloxvin's life. Paloxvin was the co-writer and co-producer of The Man from Planet X. I'm going to quote from Burl Lampert right now. This is what Burl Lampert told me. Quote, Jack told me once that The Man from Planet X came to mind as he was at a cocktail party in 1949 or 1950, and the topic of the day was flying saucers, and was there life on Mars? Now, Jack listened to all the theories, and when they came to him for comment, he just sort of snorted something non-committal, but was thinking, idiots. He thought, and I agreed, that spacemen were Jesus, was Zeus, was Grunt. All bullshit. But Jack being Jack, filmdom's quietest pragmatist, wondered how to turn that night's party talk into next quarter's highest earning second feature. Jack's movie inspirations were always what would bring in the most for the least, but he didn't really press this talent, it just happened. But innovation, however inadvertent, happened to him a lot. He created the little spaceman as a benevolent visitor from the unknown. Now, was that Jack or what? Not an invader, but a neighbor, praising our lawn. Jack was proudest, however, that he made The Man from Planet X in 9 days for $41,000 and that it was good. So, based on that comment, it definitely seems as if the popularities of UFOs is what led to Paloxvin wanting to make a movie about an alien invasion. Now, what's interesting is that in 1997, a year in which Edgar Ulmer and The Man from Planet X were even more obscure than they are in 2024, a book came out that you might be familiar with called The Day After Roswell by Colonel Philip Corso and William J. Burns. And in that book, Corso claimed that he was the one responsible for The Man from Planet X. Um, he claimed that he was put in charge of a perception management project that followed the crash of an alien spacecraft near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. I'm now going to quote from Corso. Quote, as each new UFO investigation committee project was created and administered, another breadcrumb for anyone pursuing the secrets defined, we were gradually releasing bits and pieces of information to those we knew would make something out of it. Flying saucers did truly buzz over Washington, D.C. in 1952, and there are plenty of photographs and radar reports to substantiate it, but we denied it while encouraging science fiction writers to make movies like The Man from Planet X to blow off some of the pressure concerning the truth about flying discs. This was called camouflage through limited disclosure, and it worked. If people could enjoy it as entertainment, get duly frightened, and follow trails to nowhere that the working group had planted, then they'd be less likely to stumble over what we were really doing, unquote. So the question is, did The Man from Planet X come about due to a conversation about UFOs at a Hollywood cocktail party? Or did it come about due to the influence of Colonel Corso's military team? It's possible that both statements are true. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I first heard of Philip Corso not in 1997. I first heard of him in 1992 when I was reading a book by Dick Russell called The Man Who Knew Too Much, which is one of the best books about the JFK assassination. And there's a chapter in there, chapter 23, Countdown to Dallas, October, November 1963. And I'm going to briefly quote a passage from Dick Russell's book. Quote, at the same time, in October of 1963, when Major General Edwin A. Walker was addressing a downtown rally of the United States Day Committee, a major gathering of some of Walker's ideological comrades was taking place in Lucerne, Switzerland. It was the annual Congress of Charles Willoughby's International Committee for the Defense of Christian Culture. In the United States, both before and after his autumn European sojourn, Willoughby was in the midst of a steady correspondence with Colonel Charles Thurot Pitchell. In 1963, Pitchell was Grand Chancellor of a mysterious sect called the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Shikshinny Knights, after the Pennsylvania town where Pitchell was based. It is not clear from Willoughby's papers just how he happened to hook up with Pitchell, but by September 1963, he had become the order's security general. Willoughby was in auspicious company, for the Shikshinny Knights had an armed services committee that in 1963 read like a who's who of retired military men at the extremist fringe. All these knights had been singled out for their brilliant and outstanding careers as soldiers of Christ and advocates of a free world. Among this group was Colonel Philip J. Corso, a 20-year Army intelligence career man until his retirement in August 1963. And after the Kennedy assassination, Corso was among the first to spread rumors hinting that Oswald was tied to a communist ring inside the CIA and doubling as an informant for the FBI. Now, Steve Snyder of The Farm has done a number of shows about the Shikshinny Knights on The Farm podcast. And so by all means, look those up. So it seems that Corso was being used as a disinfo agent as far back as the early 60s. It's important to note, however, not to leap to conclusions too quickly. I've always found it ironic that on one hand, we encourage people to be whistleblowers. If you're in a privileged position and you know that something of importance is being withheld from the American people, we would hope that someone in authority would speak up about such things. But then when people like Corso step forward, there are people who will quickly say, well, wait a minute. This guy's a right-wing militarist. We can't trust anything this guy says. But the question is, what type of guy would have access to such sensitive information? The law of probabilities would suggest that any whistleblower with access to sensitive information would more than likely be a right-wing asshole. So that's how he rose to prominence in the first place. That's how he rose to that position. So being a right-wing asshole does not immediately disqualify you as being a potentially sincere whistleblower with valuable information to share. For example, sometimes people do this with Donald Kehoe. Donald Kehoe worked with Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was a fascist. I know the word fascist has become rather fluid these days. People will say, mommy asked me to take out the trash. She's a fascist. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Lindbergh was a genuine Nazi sympathizer like Henry Ford. He was an actual fascist. And Donald Kehoe worked with Lindbergh. So some people say, well, therefore, Donald Kehoe was probably a fascist as well, or maybe he was also a Nazi sympathizer. But not necessarily. Lindbergh was a famous aviator. Kehoe had an interest in aviation. It's very possible that he was working with Lindbergh simply because of his role as an aviator. And it's also possible that the books he wrote about flying saucers were sincere. So it's important to be aware of this information, but it's also important not to immediately leap to conclusions. So Corso's role as a disinfo agent regarding the JFK assassination does not necessarily mean that the narrative presented in the day after Roswell is entirely fictitious in regard to his claims about the man from Planet X. It's really neither here nor there. It's possible that Corso and his team did influence the production of science fiction films like The Man from Planet X, and it's also possible that no extraterrestrial spacecraft crashed anywhere near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. In other words, there doesn't need to be any actual alien presence in Roswell at any time in history in order for Colonel Corso's claims about influencing the production of Hollywood science fiction films to be accurate. There are reasons for someone in Corso's position to be influencing Hollywood productions besides wanting to cover up the crash of alien spacecraft in New Mexico. Evidence of the U.S. military influencing Hollywood productions for propagandistic purposes during that same time period certainly does exist. There's no question about that. There are tons of FOIA documents proving that this kind of symbiotic relationship between Hollywood and the military industrial complex had existed for a long time, perhaps going back to World War II or even before that. And I mentioned several reliable sources about this in my book, Hollywood Haunts the World. David L. Robb's Operation Hollywood, How the Pentagon Shapes and Censors the Movies from 2004. David J. Liab's Orwell Subverted, the CIA and the Filming of Animal Farm from 2007. And Tricia Jenkins' The CIA in Hollywood, How the Agency Shapes Film and Television from 2012. And books that focus on UFOs being used as conduits for propaganda include Bruce Rux's 1997 book, Hollywood versus the Aliens, the motion picture industry's participation in UFO disinformation, and Robbie Graham's Silver Screen Saucers, a more recent book from 2015. The Man from Planet X is a milestone in film history. It's a missing link between the Gothic horror that dominated Hollywood cinema throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and the abrupt shift, the abrupt turn toward the science fiction genre that occurs in the early 50s. Bogdanovich, I mentioned earlier, interviewed Edgar Ulmer in 1970 and wrote about that encounter in a book called Who the Devil Made It, which was published in 1997. This is Bogdanovich speaking about Ulmer. Quote, nobody had ever made good pictures faster or for less money than Edgar Ulmer. What he could do with nothing, occasionally in the script department as well, remains an object lesson for those directors, myself included, who complain about tight budgets and schedules. That he could communicate a strong visual style and personality with the meager means usually available to him is close to miraculous, unquote. So, just briefly describing the plot of The Man from Planet X, you have this eerie Gothic setting of the Scottish moors, into which arrives our protagonist, an American journalist named John Lawrence, portrayed by Robert Clark, who worked with both Lugosi and Karloff in various films of the 40s. So you get that link there from the Gothic films of the 40s to now the first alien invasion film. So John Lawrence, he's been summoned to the Scottish island by his friend, Professor Elliot, who's an astronomer, who wants to give Lawrence the chance to break the biggest story of his career, the imminent arrival of a wandering planet designated X. According to Elliot, this Scottish island will be the spot on Earth closest to Planet X during its passage. The scientist has a beautiful daughter, Enid Elliot, played by Margaret Field, the mother of Sally Field, who will later play the very Fortean character, the Flying Nun. While Lawrence and Enid are out on the moors, they stumble across a strange metal object that stands about 3 feet high. It looks like it should weigh a ton, but Lawrence finds that he's able to lift it into the air very easily. There's nothing to it, he says. Now, of course, rumors of alien objects made of lightweight metal will later become an oft repeated detail in reports involving the Roswell crash. This detail, though, doesn't appear in print until 1980 with the publication of The Roswell Incident by Berlitz and Moore. The look of the man from Planet X might very well have been inspired by the captured aliens described by Frank Scully's Behind the Flying Saucers, published by Henry Holt in 1950. Like the aliens in Scully's book, the man from Planet X is small, and keep in mind this is a time when the image of what an alien is has not been made concrete yet. I mean, that image of like the small, gray, big-headed alien doesn't really become an archetype until Whitley Strieber's Communion in the early 80s. According to Scully, the dead aliens recovered from the three saucers that crashed in the desert near Aztec, New Mexico in 1948 were, quote, between 36 inches to 40 inches in height, unquote. So keep in mind that uh, when reading through this vast array of contactee and UFO literature in the 1950s and 60s, what impresses me is the gamut of possible life forms reported by people. Hairy giants, gnomes the size of your fist, cyclopean robots that hovered in midair, beautiful women with golden tresses, creatures that resembled giant owls, etc. Um, so for that reason, I think it's significant that the man from Planet X matches the aliens described in Scully's book. According to Burl Lampert, Jack Ploxman was a UFO skeptic. And whether he was or he wasn't, he was clearly familiar with the UFO literature that was available at the time, particularly Scully's book. I'm going to read now a section from Hollywood Haunts the World. It's a few paragraphs. Here's the main question. Could a Hollywood production be influenced by outside sources without the creative talent being aware of such an influence? Here's a relatively mundane example of that exact process. A few years back, screenwriter J. Michael Straczynski wrote a memoir called Becoming Superman, My Journey from Poverty to Hollywood. In chapter 26, Straczynski describes how his science fiction television show Babylon 5 was ripped off by Paramount Pictures and transformed into Deep Space Nine, a spin-off of Star Trek. During the late 80s and early 1990s, Straczynski spent 5 years pitching his concept for Babylon 5 to a whole bunch of different networks. He ends up pitching to Warner Brothers, and they accept the show for their new network, PTEN. Straczynski had previously pitched the concept to Paramount, which owns Star Trek. And now here is Straczynski talking. In the years since Babylon 5 went on the air, science fiction fans have debated whether or not Paramount ripped off our show to create Deep Space Nine. My belief at the time was that the studio co-opted the material we gave them only after they knew we were going into production in order to kneecap PTEN in favor of their own new network. I also accept that the Star Trek producers were blameless, but studio executives higher up the food chain can easily shape the direction of a show without explicitly telling the producers the source of their suggestions. Hey, listen, guys, we really like your idea for a new Trek series, but instead of doing another Starship show or something on a colony, let's think outside the box. How about a space station? You know, a port of call with a casino, cargo ships, lots of different alien races coming through, a Casablanca in space kind of thing. Give it some thought, roll it around for a while, and let's discuss it next week. Straczynski wraps up his story with the following statement, quote, in the end, only the top studio brass really know the truth of what happened, and they ain't talking, unquote. Why do I mention this? This is kind of a mundane example of how this process can occur in regards to influencing a Hollywood production without the creative people really knowing that that influence is occurring. So this is kind of an example of, run-of-the-mill industrial espionage. I mean, that kind of thing happens, we know, in Hollywood all the time, which is why you get in one summer 2 films about underwater UFOs, or 2 films about volcanoes exploding near LA, or 2 films about asteroids approaching the Earth, both in the same summer, because one film was ripped off the other. But again, that's just standard industrial espionage. The goal there is to make money. But why would an intelligence agency, why would the government want to influence a TV show or a movie? Now I'm again going to read directly from Hollywood Haunts the World. From an intelligence perspective, one of the many reasons for backing perception management films is to create the cinematic equivalent of training exercises in the form of fictional dramas. In other words, cinema as war game scenario. During Professor Tricia Jenkins' December 2nd, 2009 interview with Michael Frost Beckner, the creator of the action drama television show The Agency, 2001 to 2003, which glorified the CIA, the writer-producer went into great detail about being supplied specific ideas for his series by, quote, former, unquote, CIA undercover operative Chase Brandon. The following excerpt is from Jenkins' 2012 book, The CIA in Hollywood, How the Agency Shapes Film and Television, a book I mentioned earlier. So this is quoting Jenkins. According to Beckner, while he often consulted with Chase to enhance the realism of the show's surveillance and computer-based technology, Brandon once suggested featuring a highly advanced biometric system that would allow officials to detect almost any terrorist entering the United States. Beckner remarked that at first he was unsure why Brandon was pushing the plot line in their conversations, given that the device was so futuristic. It would have been such a great tool in the war on terrorism if we actually had it, he remarked. Brandon conceded that the technology was not real, but he told me to go ahead and put it in the episode anyway, because it would scare them. The them, of course, meant plotting terrorists, since, according to Chase, terrorists watch TV too. This exchange between Beckner and Brandon suggests that Chase was using the agency to scare potential and existing terrorists by exaggerating the CIA's ability to track their activities and ultimately to capture them. Admittedly, the strategy was a smart one, as Brandon is right that many terrorists consume American media. Simultaneously, however, the strategy belies the CIA's claim that it is invested in Hollywood only to portray accurately the agency and to educate viewers about the CIA's role. Indeed, these examples suggest that the CIA had started to use the American media much as it did in the Cold War, not just as a tool of self-aggrandizement, but also as a part of a psychological warfare strategy, unquote. Now, this is me talking again. This brings us back to the science fiction films of the 1950s. In what way were these films intended not just for the consumption of entertainment-starved Americans with a growing appetite for ufological dramas, but for foreign entities as well? The same, by the way, can be said for numerous UFO reports, some of them sincere efforts to report the truth, some of them a deft mixture of truth and untruth, and some of them completely manufactured from whole cloth that were being planted in American newspapers throughout the Cold War. Okay, skipping down in the text from Hollywood Haunts the World. In 2011, journalist Annie Jacobson published a best-selling nonfiction book titled Area 51, an uncensored history of America's top secret military base. She began researching the book after being approached at a Christmas Eve dinner party by a retired physicist named Edward Lovick, who had played a major role in the development of aerial espionage for the CIA. According to Jacobson, Lovick claimed that the otherworldly object that crashed near the deserts of Roswell, New Mexico in July of 47 was in truth a plane filled with children made to look like aliens as part of Joseph Stalin's plot to create panic in the United States, a la Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast of 1938. I'm not certain that Lovick ever related such a story to Jacobson, and if he did, he might very well have been asked to do so by his former employers. Given Stalin's reported interest in the subject of UFOs, see, for example, Chapter 3 of Don Berliner and Stanton T. Friedman's 1992 book, Crash at Corona, it's more than possible that elements of the Roswell story, whether such elements were accurate or not is immaterial, were purposely leaked to the American press in order to create a panic among the leaders of the Soviet Union. In other words, the story fed to Jacobson might very well have been a strategic inversion of reality, just another in a long line of ever-changing cover stories regarding the truth behind the now legendary Roswell crash of 1947. And truth should be read with quotes around it. This is the reason that Corso and his team might have been promoting the idea in the form of these outlandish science fiction films that American powers had access to advanced ET technology. And I write more about the Man from Planet X and the perception and management program in Hollywood Haunts the World. So getting back to Edgar Ulmer's career after The Man from Planet X, Ulmer continues to make films about dreams, synchronicities, existentialism, and overtly Fortean topics. The Western, Naked Dawn, from 1955 is heavily influences Francois Truffaut. And Truffaut, of course, was not just a director. Like David Lynch, he was also an actor. And in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Truffaut played a character reportedly based on Jacques Vallée. So it all ties together. He went on from there to make a film called Murder is My Beat from 1955, the same year as Naked Dawn, kind of a strange film noir. The Daughter of Dr. Jekyll from 1957, which is all about dreams and not prophetic dreams, but dreams actually unveiling one's present situation that has been made opaque to them. The Amazing Transparent Man from 1960. This is a very fascinating film to me. And for those of you who've read Camilio, you will understand why I find this film of particular interest. I'm now going to read from a new article that I'm in the middle of writing right now. This information does not appear in Hollywood Haunts the World. This is an article more about Ulmer's career in general. So here's from this work in progress. In The Amazing Transparent Man, a sadistic ex-US Army major named Krenner steals a nuclear-powered invisible ray created by Dr. Peter Uloff, a brilliant scientist who was forced by the Nazis to develop this exotic technology while imprisoned in a German concentration camp during World War II. The major intends to stage a coup d'etat against the United States with an unstoppable army of invisible soldiers. Only the intervention of bank robber Joey Faust prevents this from happening. Faust sacrifices himself to defeat Krenner, resulting in a nuclear explosion that decimates Krenner's Texas headquarters. Those of you who have read my book Camilio will understand why I have more than a passing interest in this film. I didn't see this particular Ulmer film until several years after I met my late friend, Richard Schoengert, the first inventor in the world to be awarded a patent in optical camouflage or invisibility technology. So I think I might have interpreted the final moments of this film differently than a casual viewer. At the end of the film, Dr. Uloff discusses the dangers of this nascent invisibility technology with an American federal agent. So this is the conversation between the agent and Dr. Uloff, the scientist. Agent: well, doctor, you and your friends have succeeded in blowing up half the county. There isn't enough out there to make ashes. Dr. Uloff: I'm deeply sorry, of course, but as I told you before, I didn't do anything by choice. I warned Major Krenner of the danger involved, but you must realize his was a deranged mind. All he could think of was the creating of an invisible army and the powers such a force would give him. Agent: you know, doctor, this idea of an invisible army is quite interesting. Imagine what our counterintelligence could accomplish if they were able to become invisible whenever necessary. Dr. Uloff: the Central Intelligence Agency has already discussed the possibilities with me. But my friend, think of the danger if the secret were stolen from us. It has happened before, you know. Perhaps it would be better if we let the secret die with Major Krenner and Joey Faust. It's a serious problem. And at this point, Uloff looks directly into the camera. breaking the fourth wall for the first and last time in the film. What would you do? He says, and then the screen fades to black, and the film just ends. So I find it interesting that Colonel Corso claimed in 1997 that The Man from Planet X was essentially a disclosure film, a narrative revealing genuine information about what the military industrial complex is up to behind the scenes, though disguised in the form of fiction. And then 9 years later, Ulmer makes another film that includes, in the very final seconds of the film, intimations that the CIA is heavily involved in developing invisibility technology for use as counterintelligence. The film then ends with a fictional scientist speaking to the audience directly, right into the camera, and warning about the dangers of this technology at a time when not a single person in the United States was concerned about such a thing. I guarantee you that the average Joe was not sitting around the breakfast table reading the latest headlines about communist influence in Cuba or the Soviets launching Sputnik in outer space and thinking, gee, I hope Congress is working on passing some stringent laws regulating the use of invisibility technology by rogue members of the US military. And not a single rational adult was thinking about that possibility at all in 1960. And yet, this film's screenwriter, whose name was Jack Lewis, decided to build an entire screenplay around this very scenario. Now, this could be a case of an imaginative professional writer just spinning a yarn for a quick buck. But it is interesting to note that Jack Lewis served 6 years of duty in the Korean War, rose to the rank of captain in the Marines, and then served as a company commander at, wait for it, Camp Pendleton in San Diego, the very same location that spawns all the chaos I document in the pages of Camilio. And soon after that, he chooses to write the screenplay for The Amazing Transparent Man. Based on the experiences I wrote about in Camilio, I think it's safe to say that this hypothetical breakthrough technology did indeed come to pass several decades after 1960, and it was probably being experimented on at the military base at Camp Pendleton. So is this just a cosmic coincidence? It's also intriguing to note that this is the only screenplay Jack Lewis ever wrote that's considered to be science fiction. Otherwise, it's a complete anomaly in his career. He mostly wrote westerns and war stories since war was his specialty. In fact, he served as the technical advisor on the critically acclaimed World War II film Mr. Roberts, starring Henry Fonda, directed by John Ford. Jack Lemmon, I believe, won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for Mr. Roberts. Is it possible that The Amazing Transparent Man is not an anomaly in Jack Lewis's career at all? It's possible that Lewis didn't think of this project as a science fiction film. Perhaps he wrote it based on his own personal experiences with the US military, just as he did with 1963's A Yank in Vietnam, directed by Marshall Thompson. Perhaps Lewis considered The Amazing Transparent Man to be yet another in a series of realistic films that revolve around the US military. So at the same time, he makes The Amazing Transparent Man one week, and the next week he makes Beyond the Time Barrier, also from 1960. A genuine Fordian time slip sends our hero, Robert Clark, the same actor who played John Lawrence in The Man from Planet X, this Fordian time slip sends our hero hurtling into the apocalyptic post-nuclear hellscape of the United States in, wait for it, 2024. I should mention the fact that not only does Beyond the Time Barrier take place in 2024, but recently I've been rereading the works of John Keel. So I reread Jadu, his first book from 1957. I haven't read that book since 1996 or 1997. And I'm reading it, and there's this one chapter where he talks about meeting this guy in Egypt who claims to be a prophet. And the guy says that in 2024, a major world war is going to break out. And that date like leapt out at me reading it in the summer of 2024 when I originally read it back in like the winter of 1996, and that date seemed far off into the future. And then there's another post-apocalyptic science fiction film set in 2024, and that is A Boy and His Dog, based on the award-winning novella by Harlan Ellison. So that would be a good double feature. Watch Beyond the Time Barrier and then A Boy and His Dog, two post-apocalyptic movies in which World War III breaks out in 2024. Now, returning to the article that I'm writing about Ulmer, The Amazing Transparent Man and Beyond the Time Barrier, though dreamed up by different screenwriters, both contain warnings about the potential dangers of a military-industrial complex run amok. The former ending on a note of caution regarding the use of experimental technologies being developed by the U.S. military, the latter concluding with a team of government officials being confronted by Major Allison's, that's the character that Robert Clark plays, being confronted by Major Allison's dire visions of things to come. One of these government bureaucrats says, "Gentlemen, we've got a lot to think about." Perhaps these warnings merely reflected the growing paranoia of the late 50s, early 60s, or perhaps this was a natural extension of Ulmer's intense distrust of men in positions of power, which one might consider a rational form of paranoia based on Ulmer's life experience. Ulmer's intense distrust of the military goes all the way back to 1934's The Black Cat, in which Boris Karloff portrays a military officer who's not only guilty of war crimes, but is also a practicing Satanist. This fear of authority figures hovers over many of his films, particularly in regard to police officers. In Detour and Murder is My Beat, psychiatrists in The Black Cat, Strange Illusion, medical doctors in The Daughter of Dr. Jekyll, scientists in The Man from Planet X, Daughter of Dr. Jekyll, Beyond the Time Barrier, businessmen and Ruthless, father figures, The Black Cat, Moon Over Harlem, Strange Illusion, The Strange Woman, The Daughter of Dr. Jekyll, and all forms of militarists in The Black Cat, The Man from Planet X, The Amazing Transparent Man, Beyond the Time Barrier. This distrust reflects the kind of healthy skepticism that Charles Fort championed throughout his career. As Fort wrote in Low, "I believe nothing of my own that I have ever written," unquote. I suspect Ulmer didn't believe in much either, except in the power of art and dreams to break people out of their perpetual somnambulant state and force people to think. Gentlemen, we've got a lot to think about. And we do indeed. And in the context of cinema's golden age, Ulmer gave us just as much to think about as Louis Buñuel, Michael Curtiz, Carl Dreyer, Fritz Lang, F.W. Murnau, Jacques Tourneur, Orson Welles, James Whale, or any of the other giants of cinema from the early 1930s right up to the end of the golden age. And that is the end of my presentation on Edgar G. Ulmer and the cinema of high strangeness. Again, I encourage you to go watch Ruthless on Election Day on archive.org. And also, before I go, my publisher would probably send assassins or ninjas after me if I didn't take this opportunity to mention that my new book, The Expectant Mother Disinformation Handbook, which is the longest book I've written to date, well over 400 pages. It was just published by Madness Heart Press on October 27th, just a few days ago. It's conspiracy hounds, Fordians, and cinema fans will be interested in this book. There's a sick laugh on every page, I guarantee it. And it's available from Amazon. But if you don't want to deal with an evil multinational corporation, then you can order the book directly from Madness Heart Press, the publisher. So I'm going to leave it there. I have nothing left to say except quoting the great Robert Anton Wilson, keep the ravioli in orbit. Good day.